Hello, everyone. Welcome to Homeline's August, it is August, webinar is a continuation of our tenant landlord series here. Today we're going to be discussing what to do with a less than perfect background when you are doing things like applying or looking to apply for rental property. We'll be joined by Sue Speakman Gomez and Andrea Palumbo. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I just want to give everyone a couple of, well, at least 30 seconds to try and get as many people in as possible before we dive into everything. But again, this is our August rendition. This is being recorded. It will get put up on our website in a few days, hopefully sooner than that, but depends on the cloud recording technology stuff. I'm just here to host and maybe answer some questions. Luckily, that is not a thing that I need to deal with afterwards. All right, so I see we had over 100 people registered for today. So I want to give folks enough time to get in and get situated. All right, so we are slowing down our count. Awesome. Oh, now it's going backwards. Okay, I think that's my cue that we should start. So again, thank you all for coming today. This is our August session of our ongoing webinar series. Today we'll be talking about what to do with a less than perfect background. What is Homeline, in case this is your first time seeing us? We are a statewide nonprofit that helps give free legal educational advocacy services to Minnesota tenants. We've advised over 325,000 renters since our opening in 1992. And again, it's free legal advice for the most part over 4 languages and email. So this is our phone number. And then these are also the languages that we offer service in. I almost said French, and that is not a language that we offer. Somali, Spanish, English, and Hmong, as well as an email option if you prefer. So a couple of housekeeping things. Like I said, this session is being recorded. So if you have need to step out, or if you have other, go back over things, it will be on our website, homelinemn.org. And then if you've got questions, please put them into the Q&A. If I will be putting links and other things in the chat throughout for folks to be able to grab. But if you actually have a question, please, 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 please put it in the Q&A, because otherwise I very well may miss it in the chat if it's in there, and I'll feel badly about it after the fact, but I won't get to your question if it's not in the Q&A. There will be CLE credits applied for this. So if you are an attorney and you know what that is, we'll get you an email as soon as we get the code once we're approved for it. Should be 1.5 standard CLE credits. Couple of things, upcoming trainings. So these are the next 2 months. In September, we're going to be kind of doing a overview of if you are going to conciliation court. What do you do? How do you do it? What to expect? Kind of a quick run through of that. So tips and tricks and what to expect out of that. In October, we're going to have some guests coming in virtually, of course, from legal aid to talk about the new shared meter regulations. So there's a really big overhaul in the shared meter and shared utility billing regulations this past session at the legislature that it's a lot of things are changing, a lot of additions are coming in. So we have some folks from legal aid coming in to help kind of guide through what those changes will be starting in the new year. All right. And then I'm going to toss it over to Andrea here in a second, but I did get a notice someone can't hear. I think that's going to be, you need to select the your Zoom audio. Folks, I don't think that's on our end. I think that might be on your end. I'm sorry. So I can't really troubleshoot anything beyond that. Sorry. But without further ado, we've got quite a bit of content to get through today. So I want to thank, first off, Andrea Palumbo and Sue Speakman Gomez for being here and sharing their expertise in this. We get a lot of questions about just the practicalities of what do you do if things have happened on your background. And so Andrea and Sue are going to be really, really helpful, hopefully, with getting some of those tools and tips and tricks out there and just understanding what the law is regarding these situations and what you can do with it. So Andrea is a housing attorney here at Homeline, and then Sue is the president of another nonprofit organization called Housing Link. So I'm going to go away and start putting in all those links I promised you, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrea. You are on mute, Andrea.
I keep forgetting that. We do Homeline's major service is a statewide hotline, and we answer a lot of questions that residential tenants throw at us. And a lot of them have to do with tenant screening. And in a market like we have right now, it's getting kind of tight. Um, Landlords can and do screen tenants. And we're looking at about in Minneapolis, about half of the people in the city are renters. In St. Paul, it's pretty close to that. And across the state, it's 20 to 30% of renters. So Minnesota's got a significant number of people renting their housing. Um, and I tried to get a fix on what the vacancy rate is right now, and Sue may be able to speak more to this, but it seems from what I found, it's about 5 to 6%. So kind of tight. Um, Not as tight as it's been, definitely. But that makes it the lower the vacancy rate, the harder it is going to be for someone to find an apartment. Landlords can get much more selective when there's a lower vacancy rate. Okay, Rachel, I'm going to need the next slide. Great. Most landlords use some kind of screening to select tenants. And this is there's a wonderful resource. The National Consumer Law Center has a lot of information and reports on tenant screening. And very often, there's two ways they can do this. A landlord can do this. Many use a screening service, and that's really the most convenient way to do this. And um, this is for a fee. And there's really 3 or 4 local screening services that a lot of landlords use. You might have seen rental history reports or Twin City Tenant Check, and they're the big local ones, but there are national services as well. And they are more efficient because they can pull a lot of information very quickly and very easily because they have the resources. And many of the local services contract with the larger screening services to get their reports done. We also have situations where landlords go down to the courthouse and look up things on their own, and they can find them on the internet. And the advantage here is there's not a cost for that. There's a cost for a person's time, but they can also do that as well. So they can go to the courthouse, and they can also get them on the internet. Not everything is available through the internet, and not everything is going to be necessarily viewable at the courthouse, but a significant I'd say a significant chunk of the information that a landlord is going to be interested in is available either at the courthouse or online. And they can and do screen, but they have to do it properly, and they have to do it legally. They have to do it right. Um, there are Next slide. I'm not going to really go in super in depth on these, but there are multiple laws that touch on tenant screening and what can and what can't be included, and how agencies can collect and use the information. Excuse me. With the federal laws, we're really looking at the Fair Housing Act is right at the top. It prohibits discrimination in housing related transactions. So that's rental, buying, leasing. And a person cannot be turned down on the basis of their race, ethnicity, national origin, sex, family status, disability, or religion. So that prohibits discrimination, and it applies to public entities, private entities, um, and federally funded housing. And the Fair Credit Report, or FCRA, regulates how credit reporting agencies collect, use, access, and share consumer data. And that really that's intended to regulate how um, how agencies can pull information and get it to their consumers' hands, basically the landlords I'm sorry, the screening companies that are getting it to landlords. There are strict regulations on how that is to be done. So that's on the federal level. In Minnesota, we have our own Human Rights Act that has additional protected classes. Um, we have marital status, gender identity, and status regarding public assistance and familial status, whether or not there are children in the family. And again, can't discriminate on the basis of those classes. We also have the Minnesota Data Practices Act, which is Chapter 13, and this is the chapter that regulates the creation and classification of records created by government agencies and the procedure for accessing that information. Then, so we've got those two layers. Then we have Minnesota landlord tenant law, and that has in 504B 173 limitations on screening fees and disclosure of rental criteria and remedies for violations. So a landlord has to say up front, here's our criteria for renting an apartment. And they have to disclose this in writing, basically before the tenant pays any money for a screening report. And if the landlord is going to take money for screening a tenant, they can't accept a fee if there's no unit to rent. So they have to know that one is available or that one will soon become available. They must give a receipt, and the applications need to be processed on a first in, first out basis. A landlord can't collect a whole bunch of applications and fees and then make a decision from that pool of applicants. They have to treat each one individually. Um, so the fee has to be paid, and that tenant is screened and approved or turned down. And for violations, if a landlord doesn't follow these regulations, oh, one step backwards. If a tenant is turned down for an apartment, the landlord has to give them the specific reason. They can't just say, we can't rent to you, sorry. They have to say, you didn't meet our criteria for income, or you didn't meet our criteria around criminal records. They have to be specific on why the tenant's getting turned down. And if the landlord violates that, then they are potentially liable for damages, fines, and on the other side of that, the tenant also, there is a penalty for lying. So a tenant really needs to provide truthful information on their applications. And then the last few statutes, 504B 241 and 245 look at the disclosures that have to be provided. I'm sorry, if a tenant is turned down. So the landlord rather, has to disclose to the tenant which screening company they're going to use and their name and their address. If a tenant is turned down for an apartment, they have the right to request a copy of the screening report that was used for making that decision from the screening report companies. Um, A tenant can actually get this report at any time, and it's not a bad idea to get it ahead of time before you apply to anything really. But if a person's turned down, they can get that for free if they request it within 30 days. If you're going to pull your own tenant screening report, and in most cases there is a fee for that. Um, there has to be a procedure for the tenant to challenge anything that's in the report. If it's inaccurate, if it's out and out wrong, they have to notify the screening company in writing what the issue is, and the company has to investigate it. And then if the information's inaccurate, the screening company has to delete it and let any place where they had sent that information know that the correction's been done. Um, if the screening company is pulling information from court data, and this is really important, they need to record the outcome of the case. It's not enough to say there's an eviction case. That raises a huge red flag. They need to the screening company has to provide the reasons for the case or the eviction and the outcome of the case. Um, and they have to verify any court information. This is a newer requirement. They have to verify court information 24 hours before they issue the report. That's to make sure that they get all information that's as current as possible. For any court information. And there's remedies for violations. The previous in the past session, they increased the possible penalties for violations of this statute, where you're looking at damages, actual damages, attorney's fees, and the cost for investigating the report. So there's more teeth in this law right now. All right. So that's kind of the landscape of the different statutes and the different laws that come into play when you're looking at records and screening. Now, when we're talking about records, what's a record? A lot of times we talk about a record like it is just this one single thing coming from a specific entity, but it's actually a combination of different pieces. So if you look at a tenant screening report or a background check report, you're going to see different things listed on it. So from the point of view of tenants, it's going to have housing court records and eviction cases, obviously, rent escrow cases, and emergency tenant remedy actions, or ETRAs. They're all going to show up. Other civil case records can appear, and those can be really anything like personal injury, contracts. They can also appear. Criminal case records can appear, and depending on where the report is pulled from, it can include arrests, it can include dismissed cases, as well as convictions. And the other piece is credit reports. Credit reports lay out payment history on loans, credit cards, accounts, bank balances, employment history, and bankruptcies and civil suits and judgments. So all of those play into each other. Credit reports kind of are a little separate from the rest of them. But all of this information can turn up on a single screening report. So one thing about Minnesota law is the presumption is that court records are public. And there are some specific exceptions for some criminal cases, like juvenile cases are not public, and family law cases. There's different instances where family law cases may not be public. And a judge can make a case, an individual case, non-public at any time. So even though there's the presumption that the records are going to be public, they may not always be. And sometimes, depending on where you are accessing the records. If you're looking at them from home versus at the courthouse, you may see some information at the courthouse that you can't see with a remote access. So there's a lot of information out there. Now, with housing records, and this is critical for tenants, evictions are public from the time they're filed, and they are going to remain that way unless they are expunged or made confidential. So the danger here is, and this is why the accurate and updated screening is so important. If someone has an eviction case and they win, um, that case has been public all along. So depending on when someone's looking at that court record, they can get a totally mistaken impression of what's going on with the case. Um, and I always tell people I'm talking to, you know what you're looking at, and you know what it means, and I know what it means, but a landlord or an office administrator may not take the time to really figure that out. So it's very important to be aware that these are public and they will stay public until there's an action to get them out of the public view. Now with criminal records, most criminal convictions are by Minnesota law, they're public for 15 years and they don't vanish. A lot of people think things are just going to fall off their record, and that's not really an accurate description. With criminal records, they are public, they're out there for 15 years. And then after 15 years, they move to private status and they can only be accessed with the permission of the subject. This is different, I should say, from court records. Unless a criminal record is expunged, it's going to be out there forever. But in screening reports and requesting information from the BCA, if someone does a background check, certain records can only be accessed with the permission of the subject. And job applications, housing applications, basically have a statement or they implicitly are authorizing landlords or employers to access that information. And finally, with credit and financial records, these are basically public. Judgments are public. You can look up a money judgment once it's docketed on public court records, and bankruptcy records are also public. They're in different court systems, so judgments are in state courts, and bankruptcy records are going to be um, in federal court and access through federal the federal database PACER. So I've got a chart here, and this is where we're looking at how information gets into a tenant screening report. And you can see it's coming from a lot of different sources. The criminal records and housing court records are coming from state, federal, local courthouse databases. Also from third-party data brokers. That's a kind of a danger if you're not pulling it directly from the source itself. Once it moves through another entity, the chances of an error starts to go up. And credit reports are coming from banks, financial institutions, credit card companies. You could have employer records in there. And screening reports are coming from landlords and managers. And those are not only the court information, but I have seen reference information where landlords are saying, I would rent to this person again, or I'm never going to rent to this person again. So all kinds of information can make it in there. Now with what can be considered and how long it can be considered, that's covered in FCRA. I'm going to take a step backwards on that. The records are still out there, but FCRA puts limits on how and when they can be used in screening. So you may have heard records disappear after 7 years, but that's the limit that FCRA puts on how long they can be part of a person's tenant report. They should not be included in a decision on a tenant if they are 7 years old or older. And the same is true with bankruptcies, but for 10 years. After 10 years, they can't be considered. There's no limit on considering criminal records under FICRA. They can be considered at any time. So that's the federal law, and many application procedures, they have to be in line with that. And there could be additional requirements, but that's really the federal requirements there. Um, we had a question about public housing. Public housing has its own individual guidelines. And if you look at, say, the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, they have a manual that has specific look back periods for different offenses and what will keep someone out of housing and what will get them in, and what is kind of the borderline. Um, Sure, we had a question about FICRA. I keep saying FICRA. It is a federal statute. It's the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Um, and Rachel can get a link to a resource where you can look that up.
Yeah, it is in the chat already, in the
Great.
but I'll post it again. Sorry. There's Andrea, you got so many links and so much good
I
information
know.
that
I'm
I'm
just
trying
gonna,
desperately to
we'll take a
link
second
to
so
here.
Rachel can take a breath. Um,
It's all good. Thank you.
and I like this chart. This is from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is an amazing reference for a lot of consumer issues. Um, but this really gives a picture of where this information is coming from. And the Fair Credit Reporting Act came into being because there 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 was just so much information moves through these companies that mistakes get made. And the law was put into effect to ensure that the mistakes from these other companies weren't affecting tenants. And initially, when it was first passed, there were a lot of lawsuits. Um, um, but they still happen. Mistakes get made. Um, and I also wanted to mention with um, getting criminal records, the best place to get those is the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. And this is actually, I'm getting ahead of myself on the next slide. Um, the next, and Sue undoubtedly is going to cover some of this too. Um, when you're considering applying for an apartment, there are some steps you should take before you fill out anything and before you give anybody a screening fee. So next slide. The first thing to know really is what's out there. If someone does a screening report on you, what are they going to find? And um, you can look up, as I said before, you can always pay for a screening report um, and call rental housing, rental history, call Twin City Tenants and pay for a report there. But you can also look at the court records because they are public and see what's out there for evictions. How was the case? How did the case end? Most cases in Minnesota most housing cases will end up with a settlement. Um, definitely take a look at those. Um, Criminal cases, I was just saying the safest place to get that is through the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. You can look up cases in in the court system, in the court on the court computers. If you get a BCA report, you're getting everything. You're going to get every charge, every arrest, every conviction, and you'll be able to see what is out there. Um, and you can get these from the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension on Maryland Avenue. It's 1430 Maryland Avenue. And you can do it by mail, or you can walk in and have it done. Um, there have been a lot of changes around background checks, and what they are used for, especially with the cannabis legislation that came out. And I'm going to put a link in the chat for the BCA's webpage that describes all of that information and how to request your report. One thing, this might seem obvious. If someone has a warrant and they go in to get a printout of their criminal record, they will get arrested. They will get taken in on that warrant. So be very aware of what's happening there if you're going to be going in person. There's a fee, and they will most likely um, take your fingerprints and run a report on those. And finally, get a credit report. You can get a free credit report once a year from the big agencies, Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian. Um, if you're turned down for housing, you have a right to get the report. If you're turned down, actually for a loan or for a credit card, you can get a credit report there too. Be really be very careful around credit report agencies or um, companies that are not the major credit reporting agencies. They will most probably be trying to sell you something in addition to getting the free report. So be very careful there. So get all of your documents together, get your housing court records together, screening reports, credit reports, and go through them and make sure they're accurate. There is a procedure for correcting that information. So if you are able to, if you have the enough time, get that stuff corrected before you're submitting applications. If you're turned down, find out why. They have to tell you why, but if they don't, find out why. You may be able to convince the landlord to rent to you if there's a mistake. You may be able to get the screening fee back if there was a if they didn't follow the law rather. I always tell people if they turn you down, ask for the feedback anyway. It's worth a try. And get the screening report, make sure it's accurate, and hold on to it. Any kind of rejection for housing or for something connected with a criminal record, hold on to that because that's possible evidence for an expungement petition down the road. And kind of the last thing I'm going to touch on, um, you've got fixes on this. For short term, like very short term, immediate short term, you can try to work out something with the landlord. They may have some discretion, they may not. Um, if the report is incorrect, then definitely follow the procedures to dispute the information and get it corrected. You can also, if there's extenuating circumstances, you're able to put a notation in the report. It has to be short, but explain why that information doesn't describe the situation very accurately. Medium term, this may actually be short term. It is possible to get evictions expunged. There was a statute that was passed that will make this an automatic process for evictions that are 3 years old or older. Um, but the last session and the session before, some legislation was passed that actually makes it a lot easier and a lot simpler to get evictions expunged. So that's something that can be done relatively quickly. We had a question about how long that takes, and eviction expungements, since they are much simpler than criminal expungements, they don't take nearly as long. Kind of a longer term remedy is a criminal expungement. That is something that can take up to 6 months to have happen, um, from filing the petition to having a final decision. And the information that is needed for that is a lot more in depth than an eviction expungement. And criminal expungements potentially involve many more agencies. And eviction expungements, you're only looking to expunge the court record. Criminal expungement, you're asking to seal a whole bunch of records in different agencies, so that makes it more complicated. And a FICRA suit, if there was a mistake in your credit report and you disputed it and they either didn't fix it or you had some kind of damage coming out of that, it is possible to file a lawsuit to enforce your rights under FICRA. For this, many people represent themselves on eviction expungements and criminal expungements. Since a Fair Credit Reporting Act case is a federal case, I strongly recommend working with an attorney on that. It's more complicated than a state case. And the last slide I'm gonna hit on before I turn things over to Sue is there is assistance out there for both criminal expungements and eviction expungements. I always tell people check with legal aid first. In some cases, they will work on an eviction on an eviction expungement rather, if they handled the underlying case. They also have clinics for getting cases expunged. The Volunteer Lawyers Network is a great resource for eviction and criminal expungements. Every courthouse has a law library and a self-help center, so they're definitely a resource to tap into. Ramsey County has an expungement clinic that they offer through their law library. And during the school year, Mitchell Hamlin has a pro se clinic for people who are going to represent themselves. They can bring in their paperwork, get advice on how to complete that and help completing it, and advice on how to best present their case. And there's also resources out there through different agencies. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk to Housing Link. Another organization I want to highlight is the Housing Justice Center. They have a program called Renters Reclaim the Record, and that is a service. If you've been turned down for housing because of something on any of these records, you can consult with them and see what possible steps you can take to deal with that situation and improve your chances of getting housing in the future. And looks like Rachel already put that link in the chat. And for legal aid and the Volunteer Lawyers Network, those are very easy to find online. So you can do an online internet search and find them very easily. So that's my part. I'm going to turn it over to Sue. Housing Link is a great resource. I can't say enough about them, and we refer tenants to them all the time. There's a lot of information and a lot of depth on their webpage. So I thoroughly recommend taking a look at them and taking a look at the information they have because it's really great. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Sue.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrea. And thank you for those kind words about Housing Link. So I'm here today to talk primarily about our Beyond Backgrounds program, but first I'll start off just saying a few words about who we are in general. And so Housing Link, we've now been around for 26 years. And our mission is connecting people to affordable rental homes, increasing choice and access for all. And we do this by advancing equitable rental housing access through web-based resources. So that's a lot of words to say that pretty much everything that we do through our website. So we really focus on how do we simplify and streamline information and get it into the hands of renters, human service professionals, property owners, and managers through our website, as well as the community at large, helping to explain some data and resources about what's happening with affordable housing in our community. So our website is www.housinglink.org. We just launched a new version of the website a couple of weeks ago. And so on the next slide, I have a picture of the new homepage. So along the left-hand side is the housing search tool. So if you're looking for housing, you can put in a city, a county, a zip code. You can even put like a major reference like, if you work at a hospital and you want to find housing near that hospital, or Mall of America, you can use any kind of large geographic reference like that for the area where you want to rent, and then select other criteria. I always recommend starting with the widest search possible. So if you're looking for, say, a 2 or a 3 bedroom apartment, selecting kind of the biggest geographic area and then narrowing things down as you go throughout your search always works better. You'll get the most results that way. So we've been around for a long time. In addition to housing search, we have information about subsidized housing. What are the different affordable housing programs like project-based Section 8, tax credit, housing choice vouchers? You can find that content through our subsidized housing page. We also have a lot of education and resource about fair housing. What are the protected classes? What do they mean? As well as education resources for property owners and managers. I always encourage renters to look at what we have on the page for property owners and managers. I know a lot of times there's questions about like the renter protection ordinances that have happened in, Minneapolis and St. Paul, and we try to create educational content about that. Oftentimes it ends up on that owner manager page, trying to help them understand what it means. We also share it out through our newsletters, and later on we'll have links for how to sign up for our newsletters. But now I'm going to dive in and really start talking about our Beyond Backgrounds program. So this program, we it's so fun. We've had over about 2,000 people who get housed over the last few years, and Tiara is just one of them. And she said, the last few years, I've had some unexpected life events seem to keep happening, which caused me to move frequently. I don't have the best credit and owe previous landlords on top of that. I'm a single parent with no additional help. I was struggling to find a landlord who would rent to me. I posted on social media in need of resources, and many people recommended Beyond Backgrounds. I found my current place 3 days before I had to move. The landlord gave me a second chance, and I'm forever grateful. So this is just one little impact story of the 2,000 folks who've successfully found housing through this program. So thought it's nice to start off with that positive story. A lot of people wonder sort of what is the Beyond Backgrounds program and how did we come up with it? We started out with some pilot programs initially, and then now we've moved to a fee-for-service model. Really what it is it's taking a financial assurance model and pairing it with renters to help get rental properties to make exceptions to their screening criteria. So what that looks like is when a renter is searching for housing, they can say to an owner, if this is something that will make a difference for you, I can lock in this financial assurance to help get me an exception to your screening criteria and get moved in. So I think it's helpful to know what the financial assurance covers, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how it actually works. So on the next slide, you'll see that the financial assurance, what it covers for a property is at the end of a lease, it can be used to pay for any unpaid rent, any damages to the unit, legal fees, or other expenses above and beyond the security deposit. So we first look at how has the security deposit been used, and then if there's any outstanding fees or damages beyond that, then a risk claim can be made to that financial assurance fund. And who's eligible for this program? So for renters, it's really important to know this is not a rent subsidy program. So a renter does have to have an ability to pay rent, whether it's through income or a voucher. So a renter just has to live in Minnesota and have an ability to pay rent and have a barrier in their background. We don't do any third-party verification of the barriers. That's just self-identified. It can be bad credit, criminal history, eviction, infrequent or irregular employment, the fact that you have a voucher or some kind of subsidy that you're working with. It can be that you're a new immigrant and you don't have a lengthy rental history. We're really open as to who is eligible for the program. We really have focused on making it a resource for any renter who is having trouble getting beyond that screening process and into housing so that they have an additional resource to help get them through the door. And then how does it work? So the renter pays a $300 fee to secure the financial assurance pool. So that's that $2,000 at the end of the lease that's available if it should be needed. It's only $300 because we maintain a pool of funds so that then we can serve as many people as possible, but we do have to cover the administrative costs of the program and have enough funds to make sure that as we pay out claims, we have that money in the pool to be able to pay for other claims that come through. We often get asked who pays the fee. It can be the renter who pays the fee. It can be a human service agency or other. We've had faith communities pay a fee on behalf of someone. We've even had circumstances where a property owner has paid to secure it for their tenant, and then that person paid back that property owner over a 6-month period, paying $50 a month. So we're very flexible in how that fee gets paid. Ultimately, we'll be looking at how we create either reduce the cost further or create a scholarship program. But right now, we do still just have the basic fee for service available at this point. One of the most important things for renters is you can enroll in the website and access some educational resource and materials completely for free at no charge. The only point in time that there's a charge is if you need to use that financial assurance portion to get the owner to make an exception to their rental criteria. So if you're a renter and you're out there talking to properties, what do you say? So the most important thing is when you're looking for housing, you want to make sure that you actually connect with someone before you apply. You want to preferably have a conversation either over the phone or in person, or at least email with someone before you ever submit an application. And you really want to make sure that you share your background and just let them know, hey, I have bad credit from when I had a job loss 2 years ago, or whatever it might be that's in your background. You want to make sure that you ask, is this something that you think you can work with? You don't want to apply and waste your application fee dollars. As application fees are anywhere between $35 and $65 on average. And so that money goes really quickly if you're having to pay more than one. And so you really want to make sure that you have an honest upfront conversation before you pay any application fees. And then also when you're talking with that property owner or manager, you want to explain how things are, like what happened and how things are different now. So like I said, if you had a job loss, because you were injured on the job or something, now you've recovered and you're back to work on a regular basis. Or if you had a substance use disorder that caused you to have some criminal misdemeanors in your background, now you're sober, you can explain what's happened there. If you, had, I don't know, you were in a bar fight when you were, 5 years ago and you have an assault conviction on your record, you can explain, what's happened since then, that your life circumstance is different now. And so really being open and honest about that and asking, is this something that you can make an exception to your rental criteria and consider renting to me based on my participation in this program is critical. The other thing is sort of that next step of if you have someone who's a little uncertain and they really are still a little bit resistant, that's where bringing in the financial assurance portion of Beyond Backgrounds makes sense. And so that's where in your conversation saying something like, if it makes a difference in your willingness to rent to me, I can purchase the Beyond Backgrounds financial assurance program. You can go to housinglink.org/Beyond Backgrounds and learn about it. And we've been doing a lot of outreach and promotion in the property owner manager community about the program. And sometimes the owner will consider you, and just helping to educate them that like, I pay $300 And then you get access to up to $2,000 above what my security deposit covers if there's unpaid rent, damage to the unit, or other expenses. So really being able to lay it out there for the property, kind of how the program works, can be really helpful. And then really getting that owner to make an exception to their criteria because of your participation in the program. A lot of times people will ask, is that possible with fair housing and discrimination? How does all of this work? Because you're participating with the Beyond Backgrounds program, the owner can make an exception to their rental criteria and the normal process that they go through, that normal screening. We also really encourage properties to think about using Beyond Backgrounds as part of their conditional approval process, where if they would normally require a double security deposit, so say rent is $1,200 a month, if they normally would require a $2,400 security deposit, instead, could they consider 1 month security deposit and the Beyond Backgrounds program? So it's not such a financial barrier to someone to move into the property, but it also still provides that financial protection. A lot of times owners talk about how they have created their screening criteria because that's what they see as the best way to protect their asset, their property, to make sure that they're getting someone who will pay rent on time, keep the unit in good condition, clean and well maintained, and be a good neighbor. It's really hard. I don't know how you evaluate whether or not someone is going to be a good neighbor based on a background check, but certainly they're looking for that financial ability through the credit report. And I think, they assume there's some kind of correlation between criminal background and how someone will behave in a property. And so making sure that you are really able to think about it from their perspective, and that they're trying to maintain this property and keep it operating as a safe community for all of the neighbors who are living in the property, whether it's a duplex with just one neighbor or a 250 unit property where you'd have 249 neighbors. They really are focused on trying to maintain a quality asset, keeping it in good operations, paying their bills so that they can continue to make the property available. So I always encourage people to think about, what about your background? How can you talk about your experience so that you help that person understand that you're going to be a good renter within their community? And then, I always like to remind people you should only apply at the property and purchase the financial assurance if they really have expressed that, yes, they're ready to rent to you. We don't want people just buying this on the hope or whim that they'll be able to use Beyond Backgrounds at the property. We really encourage you to make sure that you have had a conversation with them about, is this something that makes the difference and helps me pass your background check and get into the program? A lot of times people want to know what properties are the best ones for us to apply to. And we always encourage focusing on the smaller property owners and managers, kind of the private owners that are out there. And the best way to identify them is to look at email addresses. Any of those that end in like gmail.com, at yahoo.com, at comcast.net are more likely to be a smaller company where decision-making can happen more nimbly. When it's a larger company, it's just harder for them to be flexible in their criteria because they have thousands of employees who are accessing all of the same information and resource, and they just don't have the flexibility. So, sort of thinking about those larger companies will often be, like our emails are all at housinglink.org. And so another company like, say, Dominium would probably be at dominium.com. So you just want to look for who might be a smaller property owner or manager. Oftentimes there'll be smaller apartment complexes, duplexes, triplexes that are the kinds of units that are owned and operated by those smaller property owners and managers. And then also when you are out looking, if you're on, say, like, obviously you can search on housinglink.org. You can also look on Zillow or Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, apartments.com, rent.com. There's, hundreds of listing resources out there where you can search for housing. And oftentimes they'll have like forms that you fill out. And so when you get a reply back from a property, you can look at the email and who did that come from? Did it come from, SueSpeakman@gmail.com, or did it come from Sue@bigcompany.com? And that can be a way to sort of identify the size of the property. And you can ask them, hey, I'm working with this program. Are you able to make a decision about making an exception to your rental criteria? And it's always best to ask. The worst that can happen is they say no, but it's better to ask and hear a no than to have paid an application fee and lose the money. So those are the best ways to sort of look for properties who are going to be likely to be able to make exceptions to their criteria. Our program, we started operating it in 2017 under a small pilot project. And since we began operating it, we have had over 2,000 people who've been housed, but under our self-pay model, we have 771 folks who've been housed using the risk fund. We have about 349 properties who've participated, and we typically see that 96% of those who get housed complete their 12-month lease, and we only have a 6% claim rate. So it's been very successful. We typically see about 50% of the claims are for damages to the unit. The other 15% are for past due rent. And then I've got a couple of other slides on program impact, one that looks at what kind of backgrounds do we see within the program. And so typically we're seeing that folks have a criminal record of some kind, a felony, recent eviction, or credit score below 550. Even as agencies are eliminating, maybe looking at a specific credit score, they still are looking at credit and your payment history on things. So just for simplicity, we're still using credit score as a metric, but know that the way that people are looking at credit in the screening process is changing. They're not always just looking right at that score. And then the next slide just has what is the household composition that we're serving as far as race and ethnicity. And so, we're pleased to see that we really are, we know disproportionately BIPOC households are impacted by the criminal justice system and the eviction process more heavily. So we're pleased to see that we continue to serve good representation among the BIPOC community with the program. And then my final slide, I think the questions and the discussion are what make these webinars most interesting. So I don't want to go on for too long. So I finally just have a couple of links. One is to our website. One is to the page where we have our newsletters. I always encourage people to sign up for our newsletters because we announce any new programs and any changes first to the folks who are receiving our newsletters. And then, of course, the link to the Beyond Backgrounds program. When you go to that link, you can enroll to access the education resources. Again, that's completely free of charge to access all the education resource. It's only the point at which you need to use the financial assurance where there would be any fee involved. So that is the Beyond Backgrounds program kind of in a nutshell.
That is
So
fantastic. Thank you so much.
yes, let's roll into Q&A, right?
Yeah, yes, we got plenty of Q&A questions. We are going to start with the pre-submitted questions just because folks took the time to pre-submit them, and so we're going to honor that by trying to get through some of those. Now, heads up, some of those are going to be not specifically related to what we've been talking about today. That's fine. We encourage those, but we may also tell you that if it's a very specific issue that you should call Homeline to talk to us specifically. Like that's a good option there. All right. Okay. So let's see. We're going to start with Andrea. Get you back on the horn here. Madison is wondering, are occupancy laws consistent by state or city?
Uh, that is that's a really good question. They are generally city by city. So if you have any kind of question about an occupancy law, the first place to check is with the city and see what they are saying. Generally in the municipal code, and if they can't help you, they should be able to steer you towards someone who
Mhm.
can. But that's a
All
state
right.
by state, or I'm sorry, city
See.
by city issue, city by city.
Okay. And if you do have questions that have come up that weren't covered in the presentation, please put them in the Q&A. Just because the chat, I don't always see those and I feel bad when I miss them. And the Q&A gives me a really, really handy dandy like checkbox to know when questions have been dealt with. So that's my preference. Please do that. Andrea, if you don't mind sticking on. Um,
Sure.
basically you had talked about this briefly in your part of the presentation, but Ronald was wondering about, can ex-offenders be allowed in public housing? And do ex-offenders have a right to public housing apartments? So,
This is something
mhm,
to check with the with the Public Housing Authority. There are some federal guidelines that are just you can't work with. Generally involving drug drug manufacture, specifically meth, but drug manufacture, drug trafficking. But there are other offenses that there is specific look back periods. So a person may not be totally disqualified, but there may be a waiting period before they can apply. And that varies from offense to offense. So it's something definitely to take a look at um, and discuss with the Public Housing Authority.
yeah. Sue, Allison, they're an attorney and they're wondering, if you can talk a little bit about how undocumented and new immigrant residents can provide sufficient proof that they can pay rent?
Yeah. So it is challenging when you have undocumented or new immigrants. And, I often recommend if they're employed, any a letter that you can get from their employer that shows that they started working on X date and time can be really helpful. Having copies of paycheck stubs is a way that you can, work to show that employment history. A lot of times there's no previous rental history, obviously, because if you're coming from a refugee camp or something, you weren't paying rent. And so in those cases, again, if they're working with the agency or if they're connected to someone in the community who's helping to support that household as they're resettling here in Minnesota, oftentimes some kind of a letter of support rather than requiring a co-signer, or guarantor. You can see if they'll work with Beyond Backgrounds instead, because sometimes people don't have that financial capacity to sign on to that additional commitment for a lease. So those are some ways to sort of creatively go about covering that issue.
Nice. I'm going to keep you in the spotlight for
Great.
a little bit too. Jeffrey was also wondering, which type of criminal background is the hardest to work around?
Yeah. So, I always think that it's hard to say, that any particular criminal background is more challenging than others. I do think that sex offenses tend to be quite challenging for folks. Just there's a lot of fear related to those. Arson is another background that can be really challenging, especially if it was, related to a structure that someone was living in. So that's another one that can be really challenging. Sometimes there's supportive housing programs that are available for those situations, but typically it's things like that that can be more challenging. I do think that really looking at I think people, if they've served their sentence and they are reentering society, really leaning into the dialogue of people have done their time and they are reentering and deserve that second chance, that new opportunity, can be helpful in conversations. Just, I think, but it also can be I also think that manufacturing of drugs is another one that I don't think I see that as much anymore. I think that there used to be some methamphetamine manufacturing that was more common than it is now. But I know that's another one that can also be a real barrier for folks.
Okay. So you also then kind of, with part of that, covered a little bit of Lindsay's question about how folks who have experienced domestic violence or are victims of domestic violence can impact their search.
Yeah, and again, I mean, that's can be really challenging, and I think it can have differing impacts on someone's background. It could have impacts on your credit. You can have an eviction. There can be some criminal things in your background that could be related. And I think you know, the the more you can disclose about something, the that can sometimes be helpful, but also, you might want to be private about things as well. And so I think really thinking about, you can say like you'd been part of a relationship which resulted in the bad credit and you're no longer in that relationship and moving forward. But definitely those things can have an impact. And again, that's where being able to be like, hey, I've participated in the education resources through Beyond Backgrounds. I'm in this different place in my life. That can be helpful in overcoming some of those barriers.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna go switch back over to Andrea. So give you a break. Thank you. Let's see here. So Andrea, um, Liz would like to know, how long does an expungement usually take? And I know that's a loaded question, so you're on mute.
Oops. Before I forget, I want to kind of piggybacking on that last question.
Sure.
There is an organization called Amicus that's run through the Volunteers of America, and they work with people who are reentering, and they have resources, tips about housing, and peer-to-peer and networking groups around certain issues, like getting a job or finding housing. They're a really great resource, and I'm going to throw them in the chat.
Oh, good. Thank you.
It's tough.
Cool.
I initially, when I became a lawyer, initially I worked in criminal expungement and did a lot of work there, and it is really tough. Um, if someone has any kind of criminal record, it's a red flag, and there's certain words that if they show up in a screening report, they're red flags, and they just put a bar in the way. So that's why it's really important to know what's on your record and to take steps to deal with that if you can. Um, Initially, I should say, when I first started doing criminal expungements, people were very interested in getting them for jobs, but then there was a shift. More and more people were looking for criminal expungements for housing. So it is something that is just really front and center an issue. When it comes to eviction expungements, those are relatively pretty quick. Um, it is possible also if someone is in the middle of an eviction case or if they're going to court for an eviction, they can include expunging the record or making the record confidential as part of any settlement they make. And that is something that's becoming more and more routine. Most eviction cases are about non-payment of rent, and those cases generally end up with a settlement. And you can come up with, if the landlord agrees to it, you can come up with a payment plan. And when everything's paid off, the record gets expunged. Or it's possible, if you know you're going to move out, you can ask that the record be made confidential while you're paying off the rent that's owed, so you can actually find a place. So there are options while you're in a case for expungement. But generally, and this is relatively speaking, if someone's filing an eviction expungement, sometimes they're just dealt with on paper. Um, there are categories right now in the law that it's possible to send something to the court and have it expunged, and that's generally, I don't want to put a specific time on it, but it's generally within weeks. If you go to court on an expungement, It may take a little time to actually get into court, but you're generally maybe a month, a little more than that. I don't want to make any promises on the time, but it's fast. There's no waiting period. Criminal expungements have a specific waiting period where a person files and the petition has to sit for 60 days before court for any of the agencies that have received the petition to make an objection if they're going to object. So there's when you file it, you've got 60 days before you go to court, and then you go to court, and then it's stayed for 60 days after that. So that's why it takes so much time. So there's a longer time for sure for criminal expungements. I tell people 6 months. Sometimes those are dealt with administratively, and it's a much shorter period, but to actually get the decision, but it takes a while.
All right, thank you for that. Okay, there are a couple of other questions in here that are very specific to a person's, like, their own personal background check. So if you have a very specific situation, you know, where you've got something in your background that is either you're concerned about it impacting your safety, or you're concerned about, you know, how to, you know, dealing with like specific criminal things, you know, also feel free to go ahead and give us a call at Homeline. I'm going to move us forward to that. We can talk through kind of some best practices and steps about what a landlord can and cannot ask about, but also like what to do if you are uncomfortable with the situation. All right, and then I'm just going to go real quick through some of the other pre-submitted questions just because I want to make sure that I acknowledge that we got them. But as far as landlord responsibility for apartment complex security, that is a very specific question to a specific what's in your lease. So give us a call, Azrael. And then rental licensing and evictions, also very specific. Give us a call. And then suing for pain and suffering, that is a personal injury sort thing. You're going to need to talk to a personal injury attorney. That's not us. That's one of those things that actually is not Homeline. So one of the few things I'm going to say you need to talk to somebody else. And then standard payoff expectations for tenants, that's going to be such a case-by-case basis that there is no standardization for all that. It's what you and the tenants and the landlords and everyone can agree to. So
There is a tenant has an absolute right to redeem. So if they are facing an eviction case, they are able to redeem and basically pay the rent that's owed plus the filing fee and the service fee. So they can knock it off at one shot. But like Rachel was saying, with any kind of payment plan, that's really going to be very specific to the situation.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Now that is it for our pre-submitted ones. So I'm going to go to the Q&A of what's in there. I am actually going to try and focus on the ones that are coming through specifically for you, Sue, because I want to make sure we've only got about 17 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get through some of those program-specific ones for you.
There was one specific question, one question that came in the pre-submitted questions.
Oh,
that
did I
was
miss it?
yeah, it was about it was Avi's question. And this was a great question. How to handle background checks if a person is trans. This is an issue that we're going to see more and more. And anytime you have a name change, that is going to complicate your situation. I worked with someone who was getting an expungement and they had changed her name. She had changed her name. So there was literally two sets of records out there to deal with. So that's something I recommend that it potentially could get very complicated. I recommend that you contact Gender Justice about that. They are an organization that specifically deals with issues and legal issues around gender equality, and they can advise on the best way to approach that. But that's a wonderful question. That is something that we are going to be dealing with more and more, and especially if people are changing their names.
Yeah, perfect. All right, there's that. All right, sorry about that, Avi. I did not mean to skip you. So, all right. There are a lot of specific questions for you, Sue, so I'm sorry. I hope you got some nice glass of water and we'll get into this. So let me go back. They're swapping around. Sorry, people keep liking things and it's making things move. Um, so how do you incorporate, so you kind of covered already how to incorporate beyond backgrounds, who's not familiar with the program. And all of that information is on your website for free, right? You don't have, landlords can
Yes,
access it. You don't have to be already part of that. Okay.
yes, absolutely.
All right. I like this one. Anonymous is wondering if you have two household members applying for a rental and both have barriers, do they both need to purchase the or wait on the program?
So I would say that really is part of the conversation that you're having with that prospective property that you want to move in with. Um, I would think that you should only need one person to enroll in Beyond Backgrounds because it would cover the whole unit. But if that owner manager really was requiring that both people purchased it, that certainly would be possible. And then, I guess then there would be $4,000 available at the end of the lease rather than two. But, I think if you needed help in that conversation, we would probably be happy to help have a conversation with that property owner. Because one person should be enough, you would think. But
Sure.
all things are circumstantial.
Sure. Absolutely. So if someone is a part of the program, for the Beyond Background program, but also receives financial assistance from another community program, how do you all go about, I guess, figuring out who's responsible for paying damages that may exceed the deposit, if a client's moving out?
Yeah, so typically we haven't had circumstances where someone is part of two risk fund programs. Oftentimes, what we see is maybe an agency is working with someone, and then they might, like, if they don't have a risk fund program, then they'll use Beyond Backgrounds to help trigger that for a client. If we were aware of someone being covered by an additional agency, we would want to work with that agency to review any claims that either of us got to make sure that there wasn't double dipping happening.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. Make sure. Da-da-da.
Question.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So it looks like it's this last. So Jessica is wondering, is there much verification done on the bills that Beyond Background is receiving for these things beyond the security deposit, or is it just this is what it is?
So we have a review process. Any claim that comes in, there's like a two-step review process that happens. We require documentation from the property, depending on what the claim is for. We reserve the right to go and inspect a unit if we should need to verify that things are what they say they are. We have verified with the household that a claim is legitimate at points in time. So we have a process that a property has to go through in submitting a claim. We can take up to 30 days to review and approve a claim. Typically, we do it in a much tighter turnaround than that. And as part of the process, when a property is saying, yes, I'll be a part of this, we inform them that at the end of the lease, they then have a 21-day period to submit a claim. So just like security deposit refunds have to happen within that 21-day period, there's no reason it should take them any longer to have identified that they are going to submit a claim. So we align it with that so that it should happen pretty efficiently at the end of that lease.
Thank you.
And if we deny a claim, there's an appeals process that we have as well.
Fabulous.
Gonna cover all the bases.
Yep. Fair enough. All right. Let's switch over. Andrea. So there was a question on Douglas. I'm just going to grab your question real quick. Sorry. You asked about a bill passed regarding contract for deed stuff. One that's beyond honestly what Homeline really deals with and in general anyway. Contract for deed is its own special beast that we just don't dip our toes into those very turbulent waters. I know it's a big button issue. You might want to, reach out to the Attorney General's office. I think they had a bigger hand in dealing with that. But no, I'm sorry, that's just really not something that we are good equipped to answer intelligently on. All right, Jessica, same Jessica from before what is the statute of limitations on Minnesota landlord tenant law?
That's an interesting question. When it comes to, when it comes to evictions, obviously a person needs to be still living in the place to be evicted. Eviction only resolves who has the right to the premises, like who's got the keys. If someone is suing about a security deposit, those are generally that's a 6 year statute of limitation generally.
I
In
don't think
terms
there's.
of Oh, yeah, there's
Sorry.
not like a general single statute of limitations. And in terms of reporting evictions, there's really no limit on how long they'll be in the system. They're there until they are taken out, either by statute, because we're looking at seeing an automatic expungement of evictions hopefully happening, or until someone files a petition.
Yeah. All right. So that actually goes really neatly into Anonymous' question, Andrea, about are there any laws around how far back Minnesota landlords can go on someone's criminal history when denying them?
Except in certain situations, there's not a limit on that. Another question came in about the Minneapolis
Yeah.
housing ordinance, and that's a great example of an ordinance that puts limits on how far back a landlord can go when they're doing screening. The ordinance went into effect relatively recently, and a landlord if they go with inclusive screening criteria, they cannot look at misdemeanors with a sentencing date that's older than 3 years, and felonies I should say, certain felonies with a sentencing date of 7 years. So you've got a 3 year and 7 year limit there. For certain felonies, like Sue was mentioning earlier, the more serious ones like arson, assault, different levels of criminal sexual conduct, those are 10 years. Well, that's only for the city of Minneapolis. Outside of that, there really aren't limitations. And they also, when it comes to rental history, they can only consider evictions that are earlier than 3 years rather. So there's a 3 year limitation there. Settlements 1 year, and dismissed evictions and cannot be considered, and they can't screen out for insufficient rental history. And this is something that could come up if someone is coming out of a domestic violence situation where they don't have a rental history, or they moved around a lot due to abuse. So that's something that insufficient rental history cannot be used for screening, and they can't make a decision solely on a person's credit history, or a credit score rather, or insufficient credit. A lot of people don't have a credit history. There's a lot of people who are unbanked who don't have a financial history. So that's something that Minneapolis restricts on how they can screen. And I think there was another question kind of connected to that. Maybe
Yeah.
not.
I also want to point out for Minneapolis quick that there's two categories of screening. It's either an inclusive screening or an exclusive screening. You have as a landlord to determine which one you're going to be. If you want to use inclusive screening, it's just going to be what the the city of Minneapolis has laid out as what you need to screen on. If it's an exclusive screening, you need to tell everyone up front exactly what it is that you're going to be doing. Plus, you got to make sure that you're also complying with some of these other things. So I linked to the ordinance down there.
Oh, there was another question about landlords making their rental requirements public. And I did just a very informal survey and more some of the larger landlords, the larger companies will put their rental criteria on their website. Um, so at least with those, you'll know, okay, I'm absolutely not going to get approved there, then it's not even worth it. But um, it's really it's hit and miss.
Yeah, it's a yeah, it would be nice, right? You knew what they were before you even talked to somebody. All right. So what is the penalty for individuals who are not truthful on their housing applications?
I looked that up.
Hmm.
That's a pretty severe penalty. That's a $500 penalty.
Yep.
So that is something to avoid for sure.
All right. Let's see. Danny wanted to know if a tenant wins their eviction hearing, will that be automatically reflected on the online public record, or does the tenant need to specifically request that the court update the public record? So,
That should
um,
be included immediately, updated and added to the record. There can take some time for that to happen, but it's generally not, if there's not a decision that has to be made, like a um after a trial or something like that, or if something isn't taken under advisement, then it should be updated very quickly. Um, and in general, the court's very good about keeping records up to date, and generally, um, something should be up to date within a day or two. If someone has done an eviction hearing and they know the result is different than what's on the court webpage, then they should contact court administration about that.
yeah. We only have 3 minutes left according to my clock, so I want to make sure we're getting close. We have a couple of questions left, but I want to make sure if you can stay off for like a minute or two, that'd be great. If you can't, absolutely fine. We'll get through what we can. But I do want to make sure folks know this is recorded. It's going to be posted to our website, homelinemn.org in the next few days, once we can manage to get it out of the cloud. Thank you all for coming today. And I'm going to continue asking these questions until I'm the only one left here. So Anonymous had wanted to know, does FICRA supersede any state law?
There's a limited preemption there, so long as the state law is basically in alignment with FICRA, then the state law is going to stand. So if it's consistent with FICRA and what FICRA wants to accomplish, then that's fine. And
Mhm.
that's so that local jurisdictions are able to put laws into place that reflect their local situation. So it's not a blanket preemption.
All right. And then if so, this is a credit report question. Basically, if you get a credit report at the beginning of the year, but you find that you probably need it again at the end of the year, are there limitations on getting a credit report again within the same calendar year?
Mhm. If you want to get the free one, you have to do that every 12 months, but you can certainly request one and pay for it at any time. So that's 12, so 12 months, not necessarily a calendar year, but every 12 months.
And a hack that I've got, I know my bank actually offers like alert basically when my credit score changes. So that helps me as well, just to know like, if you sign up for that sort of alert, it doesn't really impact your credit and it doesn't get you the full report, but at least lets you know kind of where you're at generally if something is happening in between your yearly pulls. So, all right. Moving along, Liz would like to know, Andrea, can you briefly, ever so briefly, give us some general guidelines for who might be a good candidate for criminal expungement?
Oh, wow. We can do an entire webinar on this.
Yeah, that's why I wasn't certain if that was a
Yeah,
brief answer or not.
kind of in a thumbnail. Criminal expungement laws in flux. There are some significant changes that are going to go into effect. Um, that are going to allow for automatic expungement, and certain classes of offenses are um, going to be eligible for expungement based on how old they are and what kind of offense they are. So the statute for criminal expungements is 609A. So everything is there. It's not too long. Um, in general, the older the offense, the better. If it's a lower offense, misdemeanor, or um, gross misdemeanor, you have a better chance of getting that expunged. There are some things that just absolutely cannot be expunged, and that's anything where someone has to register as a predatory offender. So um, there are some absolute bars there. Um, and if a case was dismissed, or the person was found not guilty, or if there was an arrest and it never moved beyond an arrest, those are very good candidates for expungement, because they could still be floating around out there. The records could still be there.
Okay.
Um, so that's a really quick rundown, but I recommend that you look at the statute and just kind of keep in mind the older the better, and the lower the offense, the better.
Right. Um, I'm going to give everyone a chance to breathe for a second. I'll take this one. Anonymous is wondering, does a termination of a lease stay on someone's record indefinitely? If not, how much time does it take to fall off of someone's record? So this is a more complicated question in that a termination of a lease is not necessarily a public thing. It is a termination of a lease. Like if you're a tenant and your landlord said, nope, I just don't want to rent to you anymore. Here's your notice to vacate. We're done. That's not on any public record. That's between you and the landlord. If there is an eviction, that's a formal court proceeding that ends up on your public record. And so that's what the eviction stuff is. And that's what Andrew was talking about earlier about how long those can take to be expunged from the record. But an actual just termination is not a formal thing, right? So your previous landlord may tell your prospective landlord that they terminated your lease, but that's just that's what happened, but they don't necessarily have anything on blast that a prospective landlord can go check out at a website or something for that. So I want to make sure that it's clear that those are evictions and lease terminations are technically two different things. And so
Yeah.
utilizing that language, we want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. Anything to add, Andrea?
Yeah, people can people can get very worried about lease terminations or notices to vacate. And those are not court records. So they're not going to be going on a record in the first place unless a landlord makes a comment on a screening report where I gave this person a notice to vacate because they were a terrible tenant or something like that. But in general, they're not a court record.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Oh, I don't think we answered this. See if I can parse it quick. I don't know if can a leasing agent request a security deposit fee if the client does not take the apartment after offering them a different apartment than that is a very specific question.
Yeah,
Um,
I was
security,
looking at that one too.
yeah, sorry. Um, security deposits, I think, and obviously you're going to need to call us for your specific situation, but in general, security deposits are just an agreement between, not every landlord even needs to have one. That's their choice to request one or not. But if they request an additional one for moving apartments or something like that, that's something that they can do, or they're not prohibited from doing.
It sounds like you looked at one, they showed
Yeah.
you one apartment, and
Mhm.
then you were offered a different one than you looked at. That's a difficult situation, and
Yeah.
we definitely recommend that you give us a call about that.
Yeah. And there are definitely regulations around how a security deposit has to be returned at the end of a tenancy. and something called a pre-lease deposit, which is money that you pay up front to try and secure the tenancy before the tenancy actually starts. And there are also rules around that. So give us a call. We'll try and sort it out.
Mhm.
All right. And Amber, this is really more of a criminal question. I think you're going to need to talk to whatever attorney you were working with.
Give me a call on that one. I was looking at your question, Amber, and that's a little difficult. So, um, call our hotline or send us an email, and um, you might get a faster response with an email, actually. And I can go over that with you. That's kind of a specific question.
Yeah, relating to the housing. We might not
Eh,
be able to help with the appeal stuff,
Yeah.
but
So leave a message for Andrea. That way I'll get it.
yeah, cool. Oh, we made it. And only 5 minutes over. So again, well done, everybody. Thank you so much for sharing everything with us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And we will see you all next month. Have a good one. Bye.
Hi.